So, binding. People ask, the first thing
I'm going to come over and lay it flat.
people ask, how do you figure out how much binding you need? I do it in kind of a, I figure on, when I figure binding, I figure you're going to get 40 inches, usable inches, out of a width of fabric, a strip across the width of fabric. So I look at a quilt, and let's say it's 36 by 45. So I'm going to say, okay, I need a strip for the top, 32 strips for each 36, and then I need a strip plus half a strip for the 45. So that's 2, 3 and a half. And then I always add another strip just for good measure. So I'd rather have too much for too little, rather than too little. So I guesstimate on it. The other thing that I do is we usually always cut our bindings 2 1/4 inches wide. If we're doing something that's thicker, like one of the reading pillows or a pocketbook that has binding, I'll cut it a little wider, like 2 1/2 inches. Just, so that you're not struggling with trying to turn these things over. So once you decide how many strips you need, you're going to cut your strips across the width of fabric, 2 1/4 inches, and then you need to join them together. So I always recommend joining bindings with an angled seam, because what that will do is distribute the bulk of the seam across the width of the strip rather than it all being in one place. So the easiest way to do that is, I'll try to do it upside down, is you're going to lay one strip this way, and then you're going to lay another strip this way, right on top, like this. Okay, I have to come around this way. I can't do it backwards. All right? See, right away. Okay, so one strip going this way, one strip on top like this, okay? So what you want to do is stitch with from corner to corner here. You can draw a line. You can find your 45-degree marking on your ruler, lay it on here on the top. Well, you got to get one that'll fit. Oh, like here. Lay it here. See, here's my 45-degree. Lay it here and draw the line, and then you're going to stitch on that line. Or you might have a ruler around, like, say, this folded corner ruler around, and then what you can do is just place it on your strip here, and then what you have is, if you can see, I'm lining it up here, and I know it's going straight across here, and then I can just cut this away like that, and then, excuse me, and then I'll pin it, and then go over to the sewing machine and stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance going across. So that what you end up with is an angled join, which is here somewhere. Right, here it is. Okay. What you end up with is an angled join like that. All right. And you want to press your seam open. Okay. Then what you're going to do with your binding is go over to the ironing board and just press it in half. Wrong sides together. Okay. So now you have your finished quilt. Like my quilt? Okay. My backing and batting are bigger than my top. That's fine. I'm going to leave it that way. I'm not going to trim that until I'm ready, until I'm done sewing on my binding. So I've decided how many strips I need. I've pieced all my strips. So now what I'm going to do is start stitching my binding strip down to the front of my quilt. I'm not stitching on the back. I'm stitching on the front because I'm going to fold over to the back and trim it down and stitch it down by hand. So what you're going to do is leave a tail hanging. You're going to leave a tail, and you're going to start stitching about here, leaving a tail. Now this is a very small quilt, so that's why I'm like so close to the edge. So you're going to put your needle down, 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're going to back stitch, and you're going to stitch. When you get towards the end there, you stop 1/4 inch away from the edge of the top. What I do is I take a pin as I'm stitching, and I position it where the edge of my quilt top is, so I know as I'm getting there, most 1/4 inch feet will have a marking in front of the needle that's a 1/4 inch away. So I know when that mark hits this pin, I'm a 1/4 inch from the end. So I backstitch, cut my stitches, trim my thread, and take it out of the machine. Then what I do is the old fold it back. So now what you're going to do is fold this back. So it's not under your sewing machine. You can't do this under the sewing machine. You have to take it out. I'm going to fold it back, and this is now a 45-degree angle from the corner of my quilt down, like here. Fold it back, and then holding that in place, fold this forward, like so. Now this is the trick. A lot of times when you see this method explained, they say you fold it back so that this edge is exactly even with the top edge of your quilt. Don't do that. If you do that, you're not going to have enough fabric to fold over to get a nice sharp point, okay? What you want to do is leave it, just the littlest bit above. Can you see that? Just, you got to play, like practice with it, but I leave it so that I have the littlest bit sticking above the top of my quilt. This is going to give me the extra fabric I need to fold my piece over so that it folds evenly. So once you do that, I just pin it in place, put it back under my sewing machine, and I put my needle down, backstitch, then go forward, and repeat the same thing going all the way down to the end. Stop that 1/4 inch away, fold it up, fold it down, leave just the tiniest bit sticking above, pin, and continue sewing. And you do that all the way around your quilt. Some people ask me, do you pin when you're doing your binding? If I have borders on my quilt, I know that I've squared it up and I made my borders nice and straight and my quilt isn't wonky or anything. I don't bother pinning my binding as I'm going. If I'm working on a quilt that doesn't have borders on it, like these little these wall hangings I was showing you with the flannel, I will pin my binding down so that I'm not stretching and pulling my blocks, my quilt, as I'm putting my binding on. All right, so you're going to go all the way around, back to the top. Now, when you get to the top, now I've come around, now you're going to stop. You got to leave yourself some space in between for the binding part. Can you see?
Yes, I'm fine.
Okay. You got to leave yourself some space in between for the binding part, okay? Now, what you do is you're going to fold these guys in towards each other. All right. Now, again, when you read the directions, they say, fold them in so that they meet. Don't do that, because when you do that, you always end up having too much. So what I do is I'll fold one side back, and I'll iron it a little just to press it down. And then the other side, I'll fold back, and I'll leave a little bit of space in between.
And always make sure it's at the top and the quilt is hanging down from you.
Yes, always. This works only if the quilt is hanging down in front of you. Not away from you, but in front of you. Okay. So, I leave a space like that. Because if you meet them up, for some reason, you always end up with too much bulk. Then what you need to do is, what I'm going to do is cut this piece right at the fold here. This piece, because I cut my binding strips 2 1/4 inches wide, I'm going to measure back from the fold. Make sure I'm not on a 2 1/4 inches. So I put the ruler down at 2 1/4 inches, and I'm going to draw my line here. And what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to cut this one right at the fold. And this one I'm going to cut at that 2 1/4 inch mark. Okay? So then, this is the next part that I think really gets people kind of like confused. Where is that? Let me do this. And this part I think is easier to do on the ironing pad because you can stick a pin into it. Let me use this. This part might be easier to use on the ironing pad, because this is what you're going to do next. Pins. Okay. So now I have these two pieces. I'm going to take the piece that I cut a little longer, open it up, and put it like this. Then, since I'm on my ironing board, pretend I'm on my ironing board, I'm just going to pin this down to hold it in place. Okay? Then what I'm going to do is take this piece and open it up this way. Open. Okay, so I picked it up, I opened it up, and now what I'm going to do is put it right sides together on top of that piece here. And since I'm on the ironing board, it makes it so much easier to pin it down in place. Now, sometimes you didn't leave yourself enough room to do this. You see how it's kind of like a little short here? That is not a problem. All that you have to do, if that's the case, is just go back here and release enough stitches. You're going to stitch over it anyway. Release enough stitches so that it's a little easier for you to maneuver. I'm not going to do it right now, but that's what I would do. So I'm going to take this piece, pin it down, pin it down, pin it down, okay? Draw a diagonal line from this corner to this corner and stitch on that line for my joining. So let's just pretend that these pins, I have to get it up. Okay, let's just pretend that I stitched and these pins are the stitching. Okay, give you a rough idea. Okay, so that, and it's always a good idea to test before you cut, so that once I stitched it, and I have another piece to start, you see how now it joined? Once you know you joined, it's not twisted, it's not going the wrong way, then you can come back. Here we go. So here's a piece, all right? I stitched, I tested, yay, it's right. Okay, now I'm going to come back in and just trim that seam allowance. Okay. I will go with my iron and press this open, you know, just because of the bulk situation. Okay, and then I'm going to go back to my sewing machine and continue stitching this binding down. All right, now your binding is attached to the front of your quilt. Now what you need to do is the trimming, because remember, you haven't trimmed away your backing and batting yet. So what I like to do when I trim is leave a little bit of batting and backing in that seam allowance. Not a lot, just a little, because that kind of gives your binding a little bit of fill so that it feels nice and it isn't floppy. Okay, so you're just going to do something like that. And then once you do that going all around, you turn this over to the back, and this is where I really recommend those Wonder Clips, guys. You're going to turn this around to the back, bring it around, it's going to cover your stitching. Okay, and I use the binding clips because I'm tired of sticking holes in my fingers. Okay. And it works easier to do the mitering on the corners if you fold down on both sides first, like this. And then once you get in here, you just get your finger in here and you mush it around and you get a nice, tight, mitered corner. And if you have any problems, if it's too bulky or anything like that, you can just go in and trim away a little bit more of the binding and the backing that you have in the corner if it won't really lay as nicely as you like it to. And then once you do that, just use your Wonder Clip to hold it in place. And then you do it all around, and then you go back and you slip stitch. So that, see on the front, it's not pinned, but you'll have a nice mitered corner. So that is how you do continuous binding. I hope this helped. Because I know we get a lot of questions about